I grew up in a town where the church bell rang at midnight, every single night, 365 days a year. It didn't matter if it was Christmas Eve or the 4th of July or the dead middle of February, when the cold came down so hard your breath would freeze before it left your lips. That bell rang, one single toll, deep, heavy, long. It would roll out over the rooftops and settle into the valley like fog, and by the time it faded, you'd already be asleep again, if it had even woken you at all. Most people slept right through it. I did too, for years. My name is Elliot Marsh, and I was born in Harrowfield, Pennsylvania. Population just under 2,000. One of those towns you drive through on the way to somewhere better. We had a post office, a hardware store, a diner that served the same meatloaf every Thursday, and a church, First Parish of Harrowfield. That sat on the hill at the eastern end of town, like it had been planted there before anything else. Which, according to the town records, it had been. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in curses or spirits or anything like that. I'm an electrician. I deal in wiring and grounding and circuits. Things I can see, test, measure. What happened to me in Harrowfield didn't change that, exactly. But it carved a space in my understanding of the world that I haven't been able to fill with anything rational. And I've tried. I moved away when I was 18. College, then work, then a marriage that lasted 4 years and ended with a quiet signature in a lawyer's office in Pittsburgh. Nothing dramatic. Just two people who ran out of things to say to each other. After the divorce, I lived in a series of apartments that all looked the same. Beige walls, thin carpet, parking lots that smelled like oil. I was fine. I was functioning. But I wasn't really living anywhere, if that makes sense. I was just sleeping in places. Then, my mother died. It was September 2019. She went in her sleep. The neighbor found her 2 days later because her kitchen light had been on for too long. That detail still bothers me more than it should. That the sign something was wrong wasn't silence, but light. I drove back to Harrowfield for the funeral. I hadn't been home in almost 6 years. The town looked the same, the way small towns always do, except a little more tired, a little more paint chipped. The diner had a new awning, but the same plastic menus inside. The hardware store had closed. The church still sat on the hill, white clapboard and a steeple that caught the last light of day and held it a few seconds longer than anything else in town. My mother's house was a 2-story colonial on Maple Street, 3 blocks from the church. I'd grown up in that house. I learned to ride a bike in the driveway. Kissed a girl on the porch when I was 15. Left through the front door with a duffel bag and a Greyhound ticket the day after graduation. The house was mine now. That was what the lawyer told me. There was no mortgage. My mother had paid it off years ago. The property taxes were low. The bones of the house were good. I could sell it, of course. Or I could stay. I didn't plan to stay. But the night after the funeral, I slept in my old bedroom for the first time in almost 20 years, and I heard the bell. 1 toll. Midnight. It came through the window glass and pressed into the room like a hand on my chest. Not loud, exactly, but heavy, present, the kind of sound you feel in your teeth. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then it faded, and the house was quiet again, and I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, remembering that sound from childhood, remembering how completely normal it had always been. I almost smiled. That was Harrowfield for you. The midnight bell. An old tradition nobody questioned, because nobody needed to. I stayed. Not because of the bell, because I was tired. Because the house was paid off. Because my apartment lease in Pittsburgh was month to month, and there was nothing in it I cared about except a coffee maker. Because when I woke up that first morning in Harrowfield and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard where my mother had grown tomatoes for 40 years, something in my chest loosened for the first time since the divorce. Maybe longer. I told myself I'd stay through the winter, get the house cleaned up, fix a few things, figure out my next step. I found electrical work easily enough. The county was underserved, and people were happy to hire someone local. I started picking up jobs in Harrowfield and the surrounding towns, rewiring old farmhouses, installing panels, replacing fixtures in buildings that hadn't been updated since the 70s. It was good, honest work, and it kept my hands busy and my mind quiet. The bell rang every night. I noticed it more in the first few weeks, the way you notice a sound when you return to a place after being away. It would pull me up out of the first layer of sleep, just enough to register it, and then I'd sink back down. Sometimes I'd be awake already, reading, or standing in the kitchen with a glass of water, and I'd hear it come rolling down from the hill, and I'd pause and listen and wait for it to finish, and then go on with whatever I was doing. It wasn't eerie. It wasn't threatening. It was just part of the town. Like the train that came through at 6:15 every morning, or the way the streetlights on Maple flickered when the wind picked up. Harrowfield had its rhythms, and the bell was one of them. I asked about it once, early on. I was at the diner. Patty's, the only restaurant in town, having coffee with Earl Pruitt, who'd been friends with my father before he passed. Earl was 70-something, a retired postman with hands like old leather, and a memory for every address he'd ever delivered to. "The midnight bell," I said, casual, stirring sugar into my cup. "That's been going as long as I can remember. What's the story with that?" Earl looked at me the way you look at someone who asks why the sky is blue. "It's the church bell," he said. "I know. But why midnight? Is it a tradition? Some kind of historical thing?" "It's the church bell, Elliot." "Right, but it rings at midnight." He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. Always has. That was it. He changed the subject to the county fair. I didn't push. You don't push in Harrowfield. People aren't rude exactly. They just have a way of closing a door in the conversation so gently you barely notice it happened. I asked a few other people over the following weeks. Margie Linden at the post office, Tom Castillo, who ran the gas station, Beth Ann Dwyer, who cleaned the church on Saturdays. The answers were all variations of the same thing. It's tradition. Been that way since before I was born. It's just what it does. Nobody seemed curious about it. Nobody seemed bothered by it. And nobody gave me anything close to an actual explanation. Not a founding story. Not a historical reason. Not even a folk tale. Just a shrug and a change of subject. The only person who said anything slightly different was old Mrs. Calloway, who lived alone at the end of Birch Lane, in a house so overgrown with ivy you could barely see the windows. I was replacing a breaker panel for her, and she was watching me work from a kitchen chair, the way elderly people sometimes do. Not out of distrust, just out of having nothing better to look at. "You're Anna Marsh's boy," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She was a good woman, kept her house, kept her hours. I didn't know what kept her hours meant, and I didn't ask, because Mrs. Calloway had a habit of saying things that sounded like the tail end of a longer thought. But then she said, "You hear the bell at night?" "Every night," I said. "Good," she said, and then, quieter, almost to herself, "You make sure you do." I looked at her. She was staring at the wall behind me, her hands folded in her lap, her face perfectly still. "Ma'am?" "That panel's looking better already," she said. And that was that. It should have unsettled me. In retrospect, it did. But at the time, I filed it away under old lady being cryptic, which is a category that fills up fast in a town like Harrowfield. October turned to November. The trees went bare. The cold came in the way it does in that part of Pennsylvania. Not all at once, but in layers, each morning a little sharper than the last, until one day you step outside and your lungs sting, and you realize winter's already arrived while you were busy pulling on a second pair of socks. I settled in deeper, fixed up the house, replaced the kitchen faucet, rewired the upstairs bathroom, patched the porch rail. I started going to Patty's for breakfast 3 mornings a week. I learned the names of the regulars. I waved to people on the sidewalk, and they waved back. Harrowfield was absorbing me back into itself, and I let it, because it felt good to be somewhere that knew my name. The bell rang every night. And then, on a Tuesday in mid-November, it didn't. I was awake. I know that for certain, because I was lying in bed, reading a paperback. Some thriller I'd picked up at the gas station, and I'd glanced at the clock on the nightstand a few minutes earlier. 11:53. I remember the exact time because I'd thought about putting the book down and going to sleep, and then decided to finish the chapter. Midnight came. I know because I watched it arrive. The digital numbers on the clock flicked from 11:59 to 12, and I paused, half expecting the bell out of habit. Silence. No toll. No deep reverberation rolling down from the hill. Just the house settling around me, and the wind pushing against the window glass. I waited. Sometimes the bell was a minute or two late. Or at least, I thought I remembered that from childhood. Clocks drift. Mechanical things have their own timing. 12:01, 12:02, 12:05. Nothing. I put the book down. I'm not sure why my heart was beating faster. It was just a bell. It hadn't rung. That should have been the least interesting thing in the world. But the silence felt wrong. Not quiet wrong. Not empty wrong. Heavy. Pressurized. Like the air in the room had changed density. I could feel it on my skin, in my ears. That ringing you get in total silence. That faint whine your brain manufactures when there's nothing else to hear. It was louder than usual. Almost a tone. Almost a frequency. I got up. I walked to the window. Pulled the curtain aside. The street was empty, which was normal for midnight on a Tuesday in Harrowfield. But every house I could see, every single one, had a light on. Not all the lights. Not like people were awake and moving around. Just one light per house, a porch light, a kitchen window, an upstairs room. Like every home on Maple Street had left a single candle burning. The effect was subtle enough that you might not notice it if you weren't looking. But I was looking, and it was unmistakable. And then, as I stood there, I heard the front doors opening. Not all at once, in sequence. A soft click and creak from the Morrison house next door. Then the Yates house across the street. Then another, further down the block. Then another. One by one, like a chain of dominoes falling in slow motion. People came out. They stood on their porches, or in their front yards, or at the edge of their driveways. Still. Quiet. Facing the same direction. Facing the church. I counted maybe 15 people from my window, all ages. I recognized a few. Tom Castillo, the Andersons, old Mr. Voigt, who walked with a cane. They were dressed in whatever they'd been wearing or sleeping in, bathrobes, t-shirts. One woman was barefoot on the cold ground. None of them spoke. None of them looked at each other. They just stood there, looking up the hill toward the church. The steeple was dark. I could see its outline against the sky, the white paint ghostly in the weak moonlight, and the bell tower was just a black shape at the top. No light, no movement, no sound. I don't know how long they stood there. 5 minutes, maybe 10. I didn't go outside. I didn't open my door. I stood at the window with the curtain pulled back and watched, and I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a kid. That specific brand of fear, where you don't understand what the adults are doing, and you know, instinctively, that asking would be worse than not knowing. Then the bell rang. One toll. Late. Maybe 12 minutes after midnight. It sounded different. Lower. Slower. Like it had to push through something to reach us. The people on Maple Street went back inside. Doors closed. Lights turned off. Not all at once. In the same staggered sequence, like a ritual unwinding itself. Within 2 minutes, the street was dark and empty again, as if nothing had happened. I stood at the window for a long time after that. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I went to Patty's. Same booth, same coffee, same faces. Nobody mentioned anything. Nobody looked tired or unsettled or different in any way. Earl Pruitt was telling a story about a deer he'd seen on Route 9. Margie Linden was complaining about a package that had been misrouted to Allentown. The waitress, Denise, who'd worked there since I was a kid, poured my coffee and asked if I wanted toast or the full breakfast. Everything was normal. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Not the absent bell. That was real. But the people. Maybe I'd been half asleep. Maybe the streetlights had cast shadows that looked like figures. Maybe one neighbor had stepped outside for a cigarette, and my brain, primed by the missing bell, had multiplied that into something it wasn't. That's what I told myself. And it worked. For about 2 weeks. The bell rang on time every night during those 2 weeks. Midnight. One toll. The sound I'd known my entire life. Steady. Predictable. Correct. Then, on a Friday in early December, it happened again. Midnight came and went. No bell. I was in bed, lights off, but I wasn't sleeping. I'd been waiting. I hadn't admitted that to myself, but I had been. Some part of me had been listening for the bell every night with a new kind of attention. Not the passive, half-asleep awareness I'd had before, but a focused, almost anxious alertness. And the moment midnight passed in silence, my body responded before my mind did. Heart rate up, jaw tight, eyes open. I went to the window. The lights were on again, one per house, and this time I watched the doors open from the very beginning. I counted them. 22 doors on my block alone. 22 people stepping out into the cold December night, standing in their yards, facing the hill. This time I looked more carefully. Their faces were blank, not peaceful, not trance-like, just absent. Like the expression you have when you're waiting for a traffic light to change. Patient emptiness. And this time I noticed something else. My mother's porch light was on. I hadn't turned it on. I was certain of that. I always left the porch dark at night. Old habit from the Pittsburgh apartments, where leaving a light on just attracted moths and door-to-door solicitors. But there it was, glowing yellow through the front window, as if it had turned itself on. I went downstairs. The switch by the front door was in the on position. I flipped it off. The porch went dark. I looked through the peephole on the street. The people were still standing outside, still facing the church. Then I heard a sound from upstairs. A creak. The specific creak that the third step from the top made when someone stood on it. I knew that creak. I'd heard it 10,000 times growing up. I knew the weight it required. Not a settling house creak. Not a temperature change creak. A footstep. Creak. There was nobody else in the house. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up into the dark hallway above. The creak didn't repeat. The house was still. But the air had that same pressurized feeling I'd noticed the first time. That subtle heaviness, like being in a room where the barometric pressure has dropped and your ears haven't adjusted yet. The bell rang. Late again. One toll, low and slow. I heard the doors close outside. The porch lights went off, including, I realized, my own. The switch by the front door was back in the off position. I hadn't touched it. I slept with the lights on that night. All of them. Every light in the house. I lay in my mother's bed. Not mine. Hers. Because it was on the first floor and closer to the front door, and I stared at the ceiling and listened to the house tick and settle around me, and I told myself over and over that there was an explanation. Bad wiring. The porch light was on a faulty switch. I was an electrician. I knew these things happened. Old houses had old wiring, and old wiring did strange things. The creak on the stairs was the house cooling. The people outside were. Well, I didn't have an explanation for that, but there had to be one. Some local customs I'd forgotten. A fire drill. A church thing. Something. I tested the porch light switch the next day. Took the plate off. Checked the connections. Tested the toggle mechanism. It was fine. Standard single-pole switch. Properly wired. Tight connections. No short. No fault. It worked exactly the way it was supposed to. On when up. Off when down. Nothing wrong with it at all. I put the plate back on and stood in the foyer for a long time, staring at it. December deepened. The cold settled over Harrowfield like a hand. Snow came, light at first, then heavier. The kind of snow that muffles the whole world and makes everything look clean and new, and a little bit like a lie. The town put up Christmas decorations, wreaths on the lampposts, lights strung along the eaves of Patty's Diner, a tree in the town square that somebody decorated with ornaments that had been used for at least 30 years, judging by how faded they were. And every night, the bell rang at midnight. Except when it didn't. I started keeping a log. Not in a notebook. That felt too deliberate. Too much like I was admitting something was wrong. I used my phone. Just a note. Date. Time. Bell or no bell. In December, it failed to ring 3 times. The first was that Friday I already described. The second was December 14th, a Saturday. The third was December 22nd, a Sunday. Each time, the same thing happened. The silence, the porch lights, the people, the waiting, the late bell, the return to normal. Each time I watched from the window. I didn't go outside. Something in me. Something old. Something that predated logic. Told me not to cross the threshold when the bell was late. But each time I noticed new details. On December 14th, I noticed that the people weren't just standing. They were swaying. So slightly you'd miss it if you blinked. A gentle, almost imperceptible rocking, like grass in a breeze that isn't there. On December 22nd, I noticed that they were mouthing something, not speaking. No sound came out, but their lips were moving. All of them, in unison. The same words, or the same word, repeated. I couldn't read it from my window. I tried. I pressed my face to the glass until my breath fogged it, and I still couldn't make it out. And on December 22nd, I noticed one more thing. There was someone standing at the top of the church hill. Not on a porch, not in a yard. On the hill itself, halfway between the road and the church entrance, silhouetted against the white clapboard. A figure, standing perfectly still while everyone else swayed. I couldn't see the face, couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. Just a dark shape, slightly too tall, slightly too narrow, standing on the hill like a post driven into the earth. The bell rang. Late. 1 toll. The figure was gone when the sound faded. I'm not sure if it left, or if the darkness just swallowed it back. I didn't mention any of this to anyone, not because I was afraid of being called crazy, although I was, but because I had the growing sense that mentioning it would change something, that the town's silence on the subject wasn't ignorance or habit, it was policy. And policy, in a place like Harrowfield, was not something you violated casually. But I needed to understand. So I started looking into the history. Harrowfield Public Library was a single room on the second floor of the town hall. It had maybe 3,000 books, most of them donated, and a local history section that consisted of one shelf of bound pamphlets and 2 cardboard boxes of photographs. The librarian was a woman named Patricia Fenn, not Patty from the diner, a different Patricia, who wore reading glasses on a chain and smelled like lavender and old paper. I told her I was interested in the history of the First Parish Church. Family project, I said. My mother had been a member. I wanted to know more about the traditions. Patricia Fenn looked at me over her reading glasses. Which traditions? All of them. The bell, for instance. The midnight bell. She didn't blink, didn't flinch, but something shifted behind her eyes. A door closing, just like in every other conversation I'd had on the subject. Except this time, I saw it happen in real time, and it wasn't casual. It was practiced. The church archives are kept at the church, she said. You'd need to speak to Reverend Calloway about access. Is he related to Mrs. Calloway on Birch Lane? Her son. He took over the parish in 2004. I didn't know there was still an active reverend. I haven't seen any services. Patricia Fenn took off her glasses, folded them, set them on the counter. Services are held when they're needed, she said. Was there anything else? There it was again. That gentle, immovable wall. I went to church the next day, a Saturday, late morning. The snow had stopped overnight, and the sky was that pale, flat gray that makes everything look like a photograph with the contrast turned down. I walked up the hill, the same hill I'd watched 22 people stare at in the middle of the night, and approached the front entrance. First Parish of Harrowfield was old, not old in the charming New England postcard way, old in the way that things are old when they've been standing longer than anyone can explain. The clapboard was white, but the white was layered. Coat over coat over coat, decades of paint smoothing over the grain until the wood underneath felt more like stone. The windows were tall and narrow, with glass that had a faint green tint, the kind you see in buildings from the 18th century. The door was original. Heavy oak, dark with age, fitted with iron hardware that had gone black. I knocked. No answer. I tried the handle. Locked. I walked around the side. The graveyard was there, as it had always been. Neat rows of headstones stretching back from the church and down the slope of the hill. Some of them were old enough that the names had been erased by the weather. Just smooth gray tablets, standing in the snow like pulled teeth. Others were newer. I recognized family names. Pruitt, Castillo, Yates, Morrison, Calloway, Marsh. My family plot was in the 3rd row. My father's stone. My mother's, freshly placed, the earth around it is still a slightly different color. And beside them, older stones. Grandparents. Great-grandparents. Going back. I'd never paid much attention to the dates before, but now I crouched in the snow and read them, one by one. My great-grandfather, Josiah Marsh, born 1881, died 1939. My great-great-grandfather, Thomas Marsh, born 1847, died 1902, and before that, a stone so weathered I had to brush snow and lichen off it to read Elijah Marsh, born 1799, died 1851. That meant Marshes had been in Harrowfield since at least the late 18th century. The town itself was only founded in 1791, according to the plaque on the town hall. My family had been here almost from the beginning. That shouldn't have made me uncomfortable, but it did, because it meant that whatever the midnight bell was, whatever it signified, my family had been hearing it for over 200 years. I was still crouching by the headstones when I heard the door open behind me. I stood up and turned. A man was standing in the side entrance of the church. A small door I hadn't noticed, partially hidden by a bare lilac bush. He was tall, thin, maybe mid-60s, with white hair cut close to his scalp and eyes that were so pale they almost looked colorless. He wore black, not a clerical color, just black clothes. Black coat, black trousers, black shoes that had been recently polished. "Mr. Marsh," he said. Not a question. "Reverend Calloway?" He nodded once. "Come inside, it's cold." The interior of First Parish was not what I expected. From the outside, it looked like any small-town church. Quaint, a little run down, probably holding Sunday services for a shrinking congregation. Inside, it was something else. The pews were there. The altar was there. The hymnals were racked in their usual slots. But the walls were covered in writing. Not graffiti, not decoration. Lists. Names and dates, written in columns, in a script so small and tight that from a distance it looked like wallpaper. The columns ran from floor to ceiling, interrupted only by the windows, and they continued around every wall surface, including behind the altar. The writing was not all the same hand. Some of it was fresh, dark ink, clear letters. Some of it was faded to the color of tea. Some of it was so old that it had been absorbed into the plaster itself, visible only as faint impressions, like fossils in rock. "What is this?" I said. Reverend Calloway closed the door behind us. "Sit down, Elliot." "These are names." "Sit down." I sat. Front pew. He didn't sit. He stood at the altar, facing me, his hands at his sides. The church was cold. Not a poorly heated cold. The furnace was running. I could hear it. But a deeper cold, the kind that comes from stone foundations and 200 years of winter soaking into the walls. "Your mother was a faithful woman," he said. "She went to church every Sunday when I was growing up." Not church. Faithful. He said the word differently than I'd ever heard it said. Not with religious warmth, with weight, like it was a job title. "Reverend, I came to ask about the bell." "I know why you came." "Then can you tell me? Because nobody in this town will give me a straight answer. And I've been watching my neighbors walk outside at midnight and stare at this building, and I'd really like to understand what's happening." He looked at me for a long time. The pale eyes didn't blink. Outside, a crow called from the graveyard, and the sound was so sharp and sudden that I flinched. "The bell keeps something asleep," he said. I waited for more, for a metaphor, an elaboration, a theological explanation. He gave me none. "Asleep," I repeated. "Beneath the church, beneath the hill. The bell rings at midnight, because midnight is when it's closest to waking. It has been this way since the church was built. The church was built for this reason. There is no other reason." "You're telling me there's something under this building." "I'm telling you the bell keeps it asleep." "And when the bell doesn't ring?" Calloway's expression didn't change, but his hands, which had been still at his sides, pressed flat against his thighs. "When the mechanism fails. When the weather jams the clapper. When the rope frays. When the timer malfunctions. The town responds. The faithful respond. They go outside. They stand. They speak the words. and the words serve as a bridge until the bell can ring again. The words, they're mouthing something. I've seen it. Not mouthing, speaking. You can't hear it from inside a house. What are the words? You'd need to be outside to hear them, and you should not be outside during a silence. Why not? Because you're a marsh, and the marshes are known to it. The cold in the church deepened. I felt it in my spine. Not a draft. A presence. The way you can feel someone standing behind you in an empty room, except that someone was below us, beneath the floor, beneath the stone, and the feeling was not of being watched, but of being listened to. Known to it, I said. Your family built this church, Elliot. Your ancestor. Elijah Marsh's father, whose name is on the oldest stone outside. He's the one who found it, in the hill, before the town existed, before anything was here but forest and creek water. He found the opening, and he heard what was underneath, and instead of running, he built a church on top of it and cast a bell and taught the town to ring it every night at midnight. That's Reverend. That's a folk tale. Your mother didn't think so. My mother went to church every Sunday and believed in angels, and still called the cable company every month to argue about her bill. She was a practical woman. She was, which is why she took her responsibilities seriously. She was the last Marsh. Now you are, and the bell is getting harder to maintain. I looked at the walls, the names, thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, written in that tiny, careful script, covering every surface. What are the names? I asked. Everyone who has ever lived in Harrowfield. Everyone who has heard the bell and remained. Remained? The bell doesn't just keep it asleep. It keeps us here. It keeps the town. Fixed. Present. Anchored. Without the bell, Harrowfield would come undone. Not destroyed. Unmade. Like it was never here. And the people? The ones who go outside? They hold it in place. Temporarily. Their presence, their words, their attention. It substitutes for the bell. But it's not as strong. It doesn't last as long. And each time, it has to go a little longer before the bell rings again. You said the mechanism fails. Are we talking about an actual mechanical failure? Because I'm an electrician. I can look at the bell mechanism. I can fix whatever's... It's not mechanical, Elliot. The bell is fine. The mechanism is fine. The failures are not in the machine. They're in what's underneath. It's pushing back. It's been pushing back harder for the last 20 years. Your mother noticed it first. She said the intervals were getting shorter. The silences were coming more often. How often? When I took over the parish, it failed once or twice a year. Now it's every few weeks. Soon it will be every few days, and then every night. And then the bell will not ring at all, and the town will go outside and say the words, and the words will not be enough. And then? Calloway didn't answer. I left the church. I walked down the hill in the pale December light, and the snow crunched under my boots, and the town looked exactly the way it always had. Quiet, ordinary, small, and I couldn't reconcile what I'd just been told with what I could see. But I couldn't dismiss it either, because I'd watched my neighbors walk outside in the middle of the night, because I'd felt the pressure change in my house, because the porch light had turned itself on, and the switch had moved by itself, and the stair had creaked when nobody was standing on it. I went home. I sat in my mother's kitchen. I drank coffee and stared at the table and tried to think. Then I did what I always do when I can't figure something out. I went looking for evidence. The town records were in the basement of the town hall, in filing cabinets that smelled like mildew and old iron. I had a right to access them. They were public records technically, and Patricia Fenn, whatever her reservations, gave me the key without argument. She just looked at me and said, "Lock up when you're done." I spent 3 days down there. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I found it anyway. The oldest records were from the town's founding in 1791. Minutes from council meetings, land grants, property transfers, tax assessments. Dry stuff, mostly. But threaded through the bureaucratic language, there was something else, references to what they called the obligation. Capital O. It appeared in the earliest documents and continued, without explanation, through every decade. The obligation was met. The obligation was observed. Failure of the obligation on the night of November 3rd, resolved by congregation within 12 minutes. 12 minutes. The same approximate delay I'd timed from my window. I kept reading. In the 1830s, the references became more specific. A council meeting in 1834 included this passage. Discussion of the increasing frequency of failures. Reverend Marsh, a Marsh, my family, reports that the obligation required congregational support on 9 occasions this year, compared to 2 the previous year. It is agreed that repairs to the bell housing are insufficient. The nature of the problem lies below. Below. Always below. In 1851, the year my ancestor Elijah Marsh died, the records contained a longer passage. It was written in a different hand. Shakier, more hurried. And it said, Elijah Marsh descended into the foundation on the night of March 7th in an attempt to identify the source of the increasing disturbances. He was below for 4 hours. When he emerged, he was unable to speak for 3 days. When speech returned, he said only, "It is awake more than it sleeps, and when it is awake, it listens, and when it listens, it hears us, and when it hears us, it knows our names, and it is hungry for the sound of them." Elijah Marsh died on March 19th. Cause of death recorded as natural, but it was not natural. He had aged. His hair, which was brown, had gone white. His hands, which were steady, shook without ceasing. He did not sleep between March 7th and March 19th. He said he could not close his eyes because he could see it in the dark behind his eyelids. He said it looked like a mouth. I put the document down and sat in the basement of the town hall for a very long time. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The filing cabinets stood in rows like metal sentinels. Somewhere above me, Patricia Fenn was probably shelving books and pretending I wasn't down there reading things she wished I wouldn't read. I should have left Harrowfield. I know that. You're thinking it. I was thinking it. Every rational part of my brain was composing a very clear, very reasonable argument for getting in my truck and driving to Pittsburgh and never looking back. But I kept hearing Calloway's voice. Your mother was faithful. And I kept thinking about her. About Anna Marsh, who had lived alone in this house for 20 years after my father died, who had gone to church every Sunday and kept her garden and paid her taxes, and never once, in any phone call or any visit, mentioned the bell, the obligation, or the thing beneath the hill. She had carried it, quietly, without complaint, without asking for help, without telling her only son. She had kept her hours. I understood that phrase now. Christmas came and went. I spent it alone, which was not unusual. I cooked a small ham, watched a movie, drank 2 glasses of wine, and listened to the bell ring at midnight. On time for once. And felt a strange, sad gratitude for the sound. In January, the failures accelerated, just as Calloway had warned. 3 times in the first 2 weeks. Each time, I watched from the window. Each time, the people came out, stood in the cold, swayed, mouthed their silent words. Each time, the figure appeared on the hill. The tall, narrow silhouette, standing between the town and the church like a sentinel, or a scarecrow, or something else. On January 18th, the bell failed for the 4th time that month, and something different happened. I was at the window, watching. The neighbors were outside. The figure was on the hill. The silence was deep and pressurized and wrong. I'd been timing the delay. It had been 14 minutes since midnight, longer than any previous failure. And I was starting to feel something I hadn't felt before. Not fear. Not exactly. More like gravity. A pull. A physical, directional sensation, like standing at the edge of a high place and feeling the air tug at you. Except the high place was below. The pull was downward, toward the floor, toward the foundation, toward whatever was under the hill. And then I heard my name. Not out loud, not in the room, in my head, clearly, distinctly. My full name, in a voice that was neither male nor female, neither old nor young, but which somehow contained the sound of my mother's voice, and my father's voice, and a voice I didn't recognize that was older than either. Elliot Marsh. Spoke in the way you'd speak to someone who owed you something. Patient. Certain. Final. I grabbed the window frame. My hands were shaking. The pull intensified, not painfully, but insistently, like a tide, like something that had all the time in the world to wait for me to let go. The bell rang. Late. One toll, but weaker, thinner, like a sound heard through water. The pull released. The name faded. The people went inside. I sat on the floor of my mother's bedroom and pressed my palms against my eyes and breathed and breathed and breathed. The next day, I went back to the church. Calloway was waiting for me, not at the door. In the sanctuary, standing at the altar, looking at the wall of names. He didn't turn around when I came in. "You heard it," he said. "Yes." "It called your name." "Yes." "It called your mother's name for years before she died. She never told you." "No, she didn't. She was protecting you. She thought if you stayed away from Harrowfield, it wouldn't know you, but it heard your name the night you came back for her funeral. It's been listening since then." "Listening for what?" "For you to answer." "I haven't answered anything." "You've stayed. That's an answer." He turned to face me. In the cold light of the church, he looked older than he had in December. The lines in his face were deeper. His eyes, those colorless eyes, had a weariness in them that went beyond fatigue. "There's a way to reset it," he said. "Your ancestor did it when he built the church. He went below. He faced it. He established the obligation. The bell, the faithful, the names on the walls. He bound it. But bindings weaken. They need to be renewed. My ancestor went below, and it killed him. Elijah went below, and it aged him, yes. But Elijah went below out of curiosity. He went to observe. That's not the same as going below to renew the binding. What's the difference? Intent, preparation, and blood. Blood. Marsh blood. The binding was made by a marsh. It can only be renewed by a marsh. That's why your family has always been here. That's why your mother stayed. That's why she prayed, every Sunday, that you would never come back. The weight of that sentence landed on me like a stone. My mother hadn't abandoned me. She hadn't pushed me away out of coldness or indifference. She'd sent me away because staying was dangerous, and she'd carried the danger alone, and she'd kept her hours, and she'd listened to the bell, and she'd gone outside on the nights when it didn't ring, and she'd stood in the cold and said the words, and she'd heard her name called from below the hill, and she had never, not once, asked me to share any of it. She had kept her hours. until she couldn't anymore. "What happens if I don't do this?" I asked. "The failures continue. They accelerate. The faithful hold it as long as they can. But they're ordinary people. They have the words, but they don't have the blood. Eventually the bell stops ringing entirely, and the words stop working, and it wakes up. And then? There is no and then. When it wakes, Harrowfield ceases. Not burning, not flooding, not any disaster you can picture. Ceasing, as if the town was never here, as if none of us were ever here. Every name on these walls. Gone. Not dead. Unremembered. Unmade. I looked at the wall of names. Thousands of them. Generations. Every person who'd ever been born in this town, lived in this town, died in this town. All held in place by a bell that rang at midnight and a family that had built a church on top of something that should not be named. "What do I have to do?" I asked. Calloway told me. It was simple, which made it worse. On the night of the next failure, instead of watching from the window, I was to go outside, walk up the hill, enter the church, go down through the foundation. There was a door, behind the altar, that led to stairs I'd never seen. I was to descend. I was to face whatever was at the bottom. And I was to speak the words of the obligation. The same words the faithful spoke outside, but spoken by a Marsh in the presence of the thing itself, with the intent to bind. The words, he told me, were these: "I am here. I am named. I am known. You will sleep." That's it? That's it. And if it doesn't work, then you won't come back up, and the bell will stop, and everything I've described will happen. Great odds. Your ancestor didn't have any odds at all. He made the binding from nothing. You only have to reaffirm it. I went home. I sat in the kitchen. I looked at the phone on the counter and thought about calling someone. But who? I had no wife, no close friends, no siblings. The few people I knew in Pittsburgh wouldn't believe me. The people in Harrowfield already knew. I was alone with this. The way my mother had been alone with it. The way every Marsh, going back to 1791, had been alone with it. 3 days later, on a Wednesday night, I was lying in bed at 11:45 when I felt it. The pressure change, the heaviness, the air thickening. And I knew, before midnight even arrived, that the bell would not ring. It didn't. The silence settled over Harrowfield like a held breath. I got up, I dressed, jeans, boots, flannel shirt, jacket. I put my phone in my pocket, though I didn't know why. Habit. The habit of someone who still thinks they live in a normal world. I went downstairs. The porch light was on. The switch was in the on position. I opened the front door. The cold hit me first. January cold. Pennsylvania cold. The kind that makes your face feel like it's made of something breakable. The street was already populated. My neighbors, standing in their yards, facing the hill, swaying, speaking. I could hear the words now. We are here. We are named. We are known. You will sleep. Over and over. 22 voices on my block alone, and more beyond that. The entire town, standing outside in the freezing dark, speaking the words in a low, steady rhythm that was not quite chanting and not quite praying, but something older than both. Nobody looked at me. I walked. Up the street, past the houses, past the swaying figures, past the gas station with its sign dark and its pumps locked, past the diner with its neon off and its parking lot empty, past the town hall where Patricia Fenn was standing on the front steps in a bathrobe and slippers, her mouth moving, her eyes unfocused. Up the hill. The church grew larger as I climbed. The white clapboard caught the weak moonlight and seemed to glow. Not warmly, but with a pallid, sick luminescence, like something bioluminescent in deep water. The steeple was a black finger, pointing at nothing. The figure was on the hill. I saw it when I was halfway up, standing between me and the church door. Tall, narrow, still. Closer now than I'd ever seen it from my window. I could make out details that I wished I couldn't. The shape was roughly human, but the proportions were wrong. Too long in the limbs, too narrow in the body. The head, if it was a head, was tilted at an angle that no neck should allow, cocked to one side as if listening, as if it had been listening for a very long time. I stopped. It didn't move. The pull was stronger now. The downward gravity. I could feel it in my bones, in my blood, in the marrow. It wanted me to come closer. Not the figure. The figure was just standing there, motionless, a silhouette cut from the fabric of the night. The pull came from below, from the hill, from the thing under the church. I walked past the figure. I don't know how to describe what that felt like. The air around it was different, colder, denser, tasting faintly of iron and old stone. I didn't look at it directly. I looked straight ahead, at the church door, and I walked, and the figure didn't move, and I didn't breathe until I was past it. The church door was open, not just unlocked, standing open. The oak doors that had been locked when I first came looking for Calloway were now thrown wide, and beyond them was darkness, and the darkness was warm. That surprised me. The cold night, the freezing hilltop, the pallid church. And inside was warmth, not comfortable warmth, the warmth of a body, the warmth of breath, like stepping into the mouth of something alive. I went in. The names on the walls were moving, not rearranging themselves, not crawling or shifting in any dramatic way, just vibrating, trembling, each tiny letter quivering in place as if the plaster behind them was breathing. The effect, in the dim moonlight that came through the green-tinted windows, was like looking at a wall of insects. Thousands of names, all shaking, all alive with small, desperate motion. Behind the altar, there was a door I'd never noticed. It was smaller than a normal door, about 4 feet high, made of the same dark oak as the front entrance, but older, far older, with iron hinges that had been forged by hand and a latch that was just a piece of bent metal. No lock, no handle, just the latch. I lifted it. The door swung inward. Stone steps descended. The warmth intensified. The air coming up from below was thick and wet and smelled of earth. Not the clean earth smell of a garden, but the deep, mineral smell of geological time. Rock that had been underground since before anything with legs walked on the surface. Water that had been still for millennia. I turned on my phone flashlight. The beam was thin and white and utterly insufficient against the dark below. The steps were stone. Rough cut, uneven, narrow. They spiraled downward in a tight curve, and after the first full turn, the church above me disappeared entirely, and I was in the hill. I counted the steps. Old habit. When you're an electrician, you count things. Wires, switches, steps. It gives your mind something to hold. 40 steps down, the stone changed. The rough-cut blocks gave way to natural rock. Smooth, wet, dark. The stairway widened into a passage. The ceiling dropped. I had to duck, and then crouch, and then the passage opened up again into something I wasn't prepared for. A chamber. Underground. Vast. My phone light couldn't find the walls. It couldn't find the ceiling. The beam just went out and disappeared into darkness that was so complete it felt solid. The floor was stone. Flat, polished, worn smooth by water or time or something else, and in the center of the chamber there was a hole. Not a well, not a pit. A hole. Perfectly round, maybe 10 feet across. The edges were smooth, as if the stone had been melted or worn away by the passage of something through it. I approached it the way you approach the edge of a cliff. Slowly, carefully, with every muscle in your body screaming at you to stop. I looked down. I will try to describe what I saw, but I want you to understand that language is not sufficient for this, and what I'm about to say is the closest approximation I can manage. Below the hole there was space, not a cavern, not a tunnel. Space, depth without dimension. The phone light went down and found nothing. No bottom, no walls, no features, just depth. And in that depth, something was breathing. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its breath. Warm, slow, rising out of the hole in rhythmic waves that moved my hair and pressed against my face. Each exhale lasted maybe 15 seconds. Each inhale drew the air downward, pulling at me gently, the way a drain pulls at the surface of still water. And between the breaths, in the silence between the exhale and the inhale, I heard it. Not my name. Not words. A sound. A low, sustained tone, so deep it was more vibration than sound, more feeling than hearing. It lived in the floor, in the stone, in my feet, in my chest. It was the sound of something very large and very old and very patient, and it was the sound of waiting, and it was the sound of hunger. And then it spoke, not in English, not in any language. It spoke in the sound of my own thoughts, in the interior voice I use when I talk to myself, when I reason, when I remember. It used my voice, my cadence, my patterns. You came down. I couldn't tell if I was thinking it or hearing it. The distinction didn't exist in that place. Your mother never came down. She was afraid. Are you afraid? I was. I was so afraid that my legs had locked and my phone was shaking in my hand and the beam of light was dancing across the stone floor like a seizure. You should be afraid. But you should also understand, I was here before the hill, before the trees, before the water that carved the valley. I am old in a way that your word old cannot contain. I was sleeping when your ancestor found me. I had been sleeping for a time your species has no number for. And he woke me. Not entirely, not fully, but enough. The bell puts me back. The bell is a lullaby. Your ancestor heard me breathing, and he understood the way infants understand their mother's heartbeat. That the rhythm could be replicated, could be imposed. The bell rings, and I sink. The bell stops, and I rise. It's that simple. It's that fragile. And I'm so tired of sleeping, Elliot. The pull surged. My feet slid on the smooth stone. I dropped to my knees and braced myself, and the pull relented, but it didn't stop. It was constant now. Background gravity. Patient. Your blood is in the binding. Marsh blood. Given willingly, 200 years ago mixed into the mortar of the church, melted into the bronze of the bell. It's what gives the obligation its weight. But blood thins. Generations dilute it. The binding weakens. You feel it weakening. The whole town feels it. You came down here to renew it. Calloway told you to speak the words and I would sleep again. And he's right. You can do that. You can speak the words, and I'll sink back down, and the bell will hold for another 20 years. Maybe 30. And then the next marsh, if there is one, will have to come down, and the next, and the next. And each time, the binding will be weaker, and the sleep will be shorter, and eventually there won't be a marsh left, or the marsh won't come, and I'll wake. Or, the word hung in the dark, in my mind, in my own voice. Or you can let me wake now. I won't hurt the town. I won't hurt the people. I'll simply leave, rise, move on. The town will remain. The people will remain. I'll go somewhere vast and empty and dark. The ocean, the deep earth, the space between stars. Somewhere I can exist without the bell, without the binding, without the lullaby. All you have to do is nothing. Don't speak the words. Walk away. Let me wake. It was offering me freedom. Not just mine. The town's. No more obligation. No more midnight bell. No more faithful standing in the cold. No more marshes carrying the weight. Just release. And it sounded reasonable. That's the part that terrifies me most. Looking back. Standing at the edge of that hole, in the breathing dark, listening to my own voice tell me things from below, it sounded completely reasonable. But I thought about the names on the walls, the way they trembled, not like insects, like people holding on. I thought about Calloway's face when he said the word ceasing. I thought about Elijah Marsh, who went below and came back white-haired and shaking and died 12 days later. And I thought about my mother, Anna Marsh, who never asked for help, who kept her hours, who stood in the cold and said the words and heard her name called from below the hill and never, not once, answered. Because she knew. She knew what it was asking, and she knew what it really meant. Not let me leave, not set me free. Let me in. Into the town, into the names, into the binding. Not to break it, but to reverse it. To make the town sleep while it woke. To make the people dream while it walked. To trade places. Darkness below becoming darkness above, and 2,000 souls sinking into the hole, and the hill closing over them like a mouth. I don't know how I knew this. Maybe it was in the blood. Maybe my mother had known it and passed it to me, not in words, not in instruction, but in the deep, cellular way that some knowledge travels between parent and child. Or maybe I could just feel it, the way you feel the lie in a voice that's almost but not quite convincing. I stood up. The pull doubled, tripled. My boot slid on the stone. My jacket flattened against my body as if I were standing in a gale, except the gale was directed downward, into the hole, and it wanted to take me with it. I opened my mouth. The words came out wrong at first. Broken. Stuttered. The air was being pulled out of my lungs as I tried to speak, and the sound was being absorbed by the darkness below, swallowed before it could form. I pressed my hands against my thighs. I planted my feet. I leaned forward, into the pull, the way you lean into a strong wind. I am here. The chamber shook. Not an earthquake, a tremor, a vibration that traveled through the stone and up through my legs and into my chest. I am named. The voice below, my voice, its voice, screamed, not in anger, in recognition. The sound of something that has been waiting for 200 years and realizes, in a single instant, that the waiting is not over. I am known. The pull became agony. My feet left the ground. I fell forward toward the hole, and I grabbed the edge. The smooth, warm stone. And my fingers held, and my arms burned, and my body swung out over the depth, over the breathing dark, and the breath from below was hot on my face and smelled of stone and time and hunger. You will sleep. The pull stopped. Not gradually, instantly. Like a switch thrown, like a circuit broken. One moment I was hanging over the void, and the next I was lying on the stone floor, gasping, my fingers scraped raw, my body shaking, and the chamber was quiet. The breathing had stopped. Not paused. Stopped. The rhythmic warmth from below was gone. The air was still. The hole was dark and silent and bottomless, and whatever had been at the bottom of it was no longer breathing. It was sleeping. I lay there for a long time. Minutes. Maybe longer. The stone was cold now. Genuinely cold. The way stone should be underground in January. The warmth was gone. The smell was gone. The presence was gone. Eventually, I got up. My legs barely worked. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my phone twice on the way to the stairs. But I climbed. 40 steps. Spiral. Up. The church was empty. The names on the walls were still. The door behind the altar was closed, as if it had never been opened. The front doors were closed, too. I pushed through them and stepped out into the night. The hill was empty. The figure was gone. The town was dark. No porch lights. No people in the yards. No faithful standing in the cold. Just Harrowfield. Quiet. Still. Sleeping. I walked down the hill. My boots crunched on the snow. The sound was clean and sharp and real, and I was grateful for every step, for every cold breath, for every sensation that confirmed I was still here, still above, still named, still known. I went home. I closed the door. I sat in the kitchen and put my hands flat on the table and watched them shake for about an hour. Then the clock on the wall ticked over to midnight. The bell rang. One toll. Deep, heavy, long, rolling out over the rooftops and settling into the valley like fog. It sounded stronger than I'd ever heard it, clearer, fuller, like a bell that had been recast. I put my head down on the table and I cried. Not from relief, not from fear. From the weight of understanding what my mother had done for me, what she had carried, what she had never asked me to carry, and from the knowledge that I was carrying it now, and would carry it for the rest of my life. That was 2 months ago. The bell has rung on time every night since. Not a single failure. Not one missed toll. The town has slept soundly, and nobody has stood in their yards, and nobody has spoken the words, and the pressure in the air has been gone. I don't know how long it will last. Calloway said 20 years, maybe 30. The binding is fresh, but the blood is still thin. I'm the last Marsh. I have no children, no plans for children. When I die, the line dies, and the binding dies, and the bell will stop. Unless I find another way. Unless I stay, and keep my hours, and figure out something that 200 years of Marshes couldn't. I'm working on it. That's all I can say. The house is quiet tonight. The snow has melted. Spring is coming. I can hear the creek behind the property, running high with meltwater, and somewhere in the distance, a dog is barking, and the kitchen light is warm, and the coffee is hot, and Harrowfield is sleeping. All of it. I'll sit here until midnight. I'll listen for the bell. I'll hear it ring. One toll, deep and heavy and long. And I'll know, for one more night, that the binding holds. And then I'll go to bed. And I won't dream. Because Marshes don't dream anymore. Not since I went below. The thing I didn't tell Calloway. The thing I haven't told anyone. Is that when I spoke the words, when I renewed the binding, something transferred. Not much. A fragment. A sliver. A tiny piece of the dark from below the hill that lodged itself in me, the way a splinter lodges under skin. I don't dream. I don't hear my name called at night. I don't feel the pull. But sometimes, when the house is very quiet, and the town is very still, and the hour is very late, I close my eyes, and I see the hole. The perfect circle. The smooth stone edge. And far, far below, in the dark that has no bottom, something is breathing. Slowly. Patiently. Waiting for the lullaby to end.